Hey everybody, thank you so much for being here. First off, I see some familiar faces. Thank y'all for coming back, or if this is your first time uh, being in one of our presentations, thank you so much. So for anybody who doesn't know me, my name's Carl Blair. I am TCRP's election protection attorney for this election cycle. And my colleague Veronica Worms, we co-lead the TCRP election protection legal program. And so part of that, and a part that we really enjoy, is getting to put on CLEs like tonight's presentation. This is part 2 of a 4-part summer CLE series. And we'll give you a little bit more information about the last 2 presentations at the end of tonight's discussion. So let's get started. Let me share my screen with everybody and we will jump into the ballot counting, canvassing, and certifying process. So I think one of the first things that I'm going to start off with, we always start off with just a brief introduction of our organization for anybody who may not be aware. We are TCRP, the Texas Civil Rights Project. We are a nonpartisan 501c3. We're a nonprofit organization as well. We were founded in 1990. And currently we have 3 programs. We have a Beyond Borders program that deals with border and immigration issues. We have a criminal and justice program that deals with criminal justice reforms. And then we have voting rights. And like I said, that includes Veronica and myself as the EP legal team. And we also have an EP field team. And in the voting rights team, we advocate for Texas voters through every step of the voting process. So we always like to start off all of our presentations with a roadmap, just kind of give everybody an idea of what we're going to be talking about tonight. And so for tonight's presentation, the very first question is, why are we talking about these issues? What's important about these issues as we head into November's general election? So after we get through that discussion, we're going to talk about the ballot counting process in Texas. We're going to talk about how election returns are canvassed. And then we're going to finish up by talking about how elections are certified. And before we dive into our discussion tonight, I just want to give a really big shout out and thanks to our law clerk, Tomas Russo. He really helped me organize this presentation, and he gave me a lot of really helpful suggestions about how to make this presentation easier to follow. Because it's a lot of information that I'm going to be throwing your way, and he really helped organize this for me. So big shout out to Tomas for that. All right, so let's dive into that first topic. Why are we talking about this?
Carl, I think your screen is frozen. If you want me to take over advancing.
Yeah, if you don't mind, sure. Thank you, Veronica. Yeah, sorry, folks. I'm in Houston, and our internet is still wonky after Beryl hit us a couple of weeks ago. So thank you so much, Veronica.
Okay, can everyone see?
We're still seeing. There it goes.
Yeah, we're on slide 4 right now, Veronica. Thank you so much for jumping in. Yeah, so again, sorry about that. Sorry about the technical issues, folks. That's why it's always fantastic to have such a wonderful colleague as Veronica on to help with that type of problem. So, but yeah, let's dive back into why we're talking about this topic. So, as we all remember, the presidential election in 2020 was very politicized. It was very heavily contested. A number of conspiracy theories and unsubstantiated claims about election fraud, voter fraud, were waged and raged around the results of the 2020 election. And as we also remember, that all culminated on January 6th, 2021, when Congress was in session to certify President Biden's Electoral College victory. So, as we all know, after the preceding 3.5 years, thousands of pages of investigative documents have been written about what happened that day. I wanted to just provide like the briefest of timelines that just directly tie into the types of issues that we're going to be talking about tonight. So, this, again, super abbreviated version of what happened on that day. So again, on January 6, 2021, Congress was in session. Both houses were in joint session to certify President Biden's Electoral College victory. So at about 1:15 in the afternoon, Representative Paul Gosar from Arizona actually raised an objection to the certification of the Electoral College results from Arizona. As is the House and Senate's rules on this procedure, both houses adjourned to debate the objection in their respective houses. While they were adjourned, that's when the Capitol was stormed by a mob of President Trump's supporters, which, as we know, delayed congressional action until approximately 8 p.m. that night. After the houses reconvened, objections were actually raised to the certification of the Electoral College results in Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin as well. Votes were actually only taken on the objections to certification for Arizona and Pennsylvania. The other objections were dismissed without a vote being taken. But through all of those votes, 147 senators and representatives voted to refuse to certify the results from at least one of those two states. Next slide, please. So again, why are we still talking about this 3.5 years later? Since January 6th, we've actually seen multiple examples of bad faith actors attempting to subvert the post-election process. Again, as I stated, I actually live in Houston, and right here in Harris County, one of our county commissioners voted against certifying the results of the November 2021 state constitutional amendment election, citing, quote, grave concerns about delayed reporting of results and unfamiliarity with new voting machines. I will note that all other members of the county commissioners court, all of the other 3 county commissioners and our county judge all voted in favor of certification. In Otero County, New Mexico, the county commission refused to certify the results of the state's June 2022 primary, again citing concerns about voting machines. Subsequently, the New Mexico State Supreme Court ordered the commission to certify the election results, which they eventually did. And also in 2022, in Cochise County, Arizona, the county's Board of Supervisors voted against certifying the results of the November 2022 general election, once again citing unsubstantiated concerns about the untrustworthiness of the county's voting machines. And in that case, a state judge ordered that the certification be completed. Next slide, please. So all told, in just the 2022 election cycle alone, challenges and threats of refusing to follow post-election requirements regarding the counting, canvassing, and or certification of election results were reported in multiple states across the county. We saw them in Cochise and Mojave counties in Arizona. We saw them in Surrey County, North Carolina, Esmeralda County, Nevada, Otero County, New Mexico, and then Berks, Fayette, Lancaster, and Luzerne counties in Pennsylvania. So while all of the specifics that these actors were challenging or threatening to refuse to follow were, of course, different because they occurred in different states, it really shows the importance of more of a widespread understanding of what the post-election process actually looks like, what the legal requirements are, what safeguards and backstops are in place to make sure that voters' votes are counted reliably and reported correctly as well. And that's really why we're here tonight, to talk about these issues. Our hope is that by going through the process and procedures that dictate how the counting process, the canvassing process, and the certification process are run in Texas, that any of these conspiracy theories and misinformation and disinformation can lose some of its potency. So with that, Veronica, if you go to the next slide, we can jump into the ballot counting process. And for all of these sections, I've put a citation, well, kind of a citation to the election code. You'll see that the ballot counting process takes up 2 entire chapters of the election code. The canvassing process takes up 1 chapter, and the certification process takes up 1 tiny section of the election code. So the ballot counting process is in chapter 65 and chapter 127 of the Texas election code. And so we're gonna have to discuss a couple of different things here. So we're going to start off by discussing what's known as the traditional polling place setup. And that's, and keep in your minds when we're talking about traditional polling place setup, that's going to be the counties where a voter has a specific assigned precinct that they have to go vote in on election day. That's what we mean by the traditional polling place setup. Then we're going to talk about the central counting station method, we're going to move into a discussion about how early and mail-in ballots are counted. And then we're going to wrap up this section of the presentation by talking about provisional ballots and how they're counted. So next slide, please. So like I said, we're going to start with the traditional polling place setup. And remember, keep in mind when we're talking about traditional polling place setup, that this is going to be on election day, a voter has an assigned precinct that they have to go to. So in any of the traditional polling place setup counties, a presiding judge of each polling place is going to designate a team of election officers. So they're going to be made up of the alternate election judge and any election clerks that are serving. And these teams are going to be called counting officers. They're going to serve as counting officers. And each team of counting officers must consist of 2 or more election officers. And a little bit later, a couple of slides from now, we're going to see why there has to be at least 2 people on each one of these counting teams. So the time and method for counting differs slightly depending on whether the jurisdiction uses paper ballots, optical scan machines, or direct recording electronic machines. And I want to take just a second to kind of differentiate between these 3 methods of actually casting ballots in Texas. So we have your paper ballots. That's one where a voter goes in, they mark a physical ballot, they turn in that physical ballot. An optical scan machine is a system where a voter marks a physical ballot, and then they feed that ballot into a scanner machine. And that scanner actually records that voter's votes. And then the final method is called direct recording electronic, or DRE. And these are devices that utilize touchscreens or buttons to indicate the voter's selection. So if you live in a county where you go into your polling location, you go into the voting booth and you use a touchscreen to make your selections, that's a direct recording electronic device. Next slide, please. So let's start with paper ballots. So again, keep in mind, traditional polling place, paper ballots. So counting for paper ballots may begin anytime after the polls have been open for 1 hour, so long as at least 10 ballots have been cast. If you're in a precinct where it's 1 hour has passed already, but less than 10 votes have been cast, as soon as that 10th vote is cast, counting can actually begin. So after the polls close or the last voter has voted, whichever's later, the counting of ballots shall be conducted continuously until all the ballots are counted. So there's no stopping, there's no taking breaks. Once that counting process is started, after the polls close or the last voter has voted, it has to be conducted continuously until all of the ballots have been counted. A presiding judge in this case, they have the ability to announce partial results as the count is being performed, but they're not required to do so. So here we get back to the counting officers. So as we mentioned before, the votes are counted by teams of counting officers. One officer is going to examine each ballot and announce the candidates receiving the votes, while the other counting officer records the results on the tally list, which they compare periodically. So that shows why we need at least 2 counting officers on each counting team. One person's going to read out they're going to announce which candidates received the votes on that ballot, and then 1 or more other counting officers are going to record the results on tally lists, and they're going to compare their results periodically. So a vote on an irregularly marked ballot must be counted if the voter's intent is clearly ascertainable. So what is an irregularly marked ballot? Say, for instance, you are using paper ballots and the instructions say that you are to fill in the bubble next to the candidate's name that you are voting for. An irregularly marked ballot might be, instead of filling in the bubble, the voter circled their choice's name, or they drew an arrow to their candidate of choice. So anything like that is going to be an irregularly marked ballot. And so any of those irregularly marked ballots, again, the vote must be counted if the voter's intent is clearly ascertainable. And then the final point on paper ballots, after the counting is completed, the presiding election judge prepares what's known as a precinct return, which includes the total number of voters who voted at the precinct and the total votes for each candidate or measure. And I want you to keep the term precinct return in mind because we are going to come back to that. We'll see the concept of returns features very heavily when we get to our section on canvassing. Next slide, please. All right, so moving on from paper ballots over to optical scan. In optical scan situations, votes are counted after the polls close or the last voter has voted, whichever is later. The election judge compares the number of ballots cast from the polling roster with the number counted by the machines. Each one of the optical scan machines is going to have a number number display somewhere on the machine that shows how many ballots have been scanned by that machine. So if there's a discrepancy greater than 3, then all those ballots are going to be sent to a central counting station. So for instance, if the election judge pulls out the polling roster and it says 100 votes were cast, but the machine says, say, 105 votes were cast or 95 votes were cast, all of those ballots are going to be sent to a central counting station. In optical scan jurisdictions, the judge also checks for irregularly marked ballots. And if there are 2 or more such ballots, again, they're going to send those ballots over to a central counting station. Otherwise, if there's no discrepancy, if there aren't any irregularly marked ballots, the judge just processes the election returns from the results tapes of the machines and any write-in ballots. So another feature of the optical scan machines and also the direct recording electronic machines is that they're going to produce what's known as a result tape. It's just a physical tape that just shows how many ballots and how many votes have been cast on that machine. So all of that's taken place. So the precinct returns, voted ballots, electronic media from the precinct ballot counter, any election records, and all remaining supplies shall be delivered to the general custodian of election records, which for November's election is going to almost exclusively be either the county clerk or the elections administrator, depending on the county. All of those supplies shall be delivered to the general custodian of election records immediately after the precinct returns are completed. Next slide, please. Right, and so the final method is the direct recording electronic voting machines. There's some similarities with the optical scan, but as we go through this list, we'll see that there's some differences as well. The votes are going to be counted after the polls close or the last voter has voted, whichever's later. And then after the polls close or the last voter is voted, the election judge must secure the DREs so that no additional votes can be cast on any of the machines. So when we're dealing with DREs, the election judge is going to tally the public count on each voting machine and compare that total with the total from their polling roster. Similar process to the optical scan. Each one of the DRE machines is going to have a public count that shows how many votes were processed by that machine. And then, of course, the election judge is going to have polling rosters that will show that same number as well. If a discrepancy exists between those numbers on a DRE machine, the election judge is going to attempt to reconcile the discrepancy themselves, or they can just directly contact the authority conducting the election. If there is no discrepancy, then the judge is again going to process the election returns based on the results tapes from the machines. And then this is a little bit of this is slightly different than the optical scan. The election judge and election clerk, and not more than 2 poll watchers, if any poll watchers are present, must actually sign the results tape. And then the last process, how do we get those machines over to the general custodian? The election judge has a physical lock and seal. They have to physically lock and seal each one of the DRE machines. The precinct returns, election records, and remaining supplies are placed in something called a secure transfer case. And then the machines, along with the transfer cases, shall be delivered to the general custodian of election records, again, immediately after precinct returns are completed. Next slide, please. So that was the traditional polling place setup or traditional polling place method. So there's also a central counting station method. And it's important to note just right off the bat, central counting station methods only apply in counties that use electronic voting systems. There is no method for a central counting station in a county that uses paper ballots. But if a county uses an electronic voting system, and this applies to both optical scan and DRE devices, the county can establish 1 or more central counting stations where the results are tabulated. So the authority conducting the election has to provide all of their election judges across the county with detailed instructions about the procedures to follow. So those procedures are typically more of a logistical in nature. So where are the central counting stations? Who do you talk to once you arrive with the DRE machines or with the optical scan machines and the records? Those. So every county that has a central counting station is going to have slightly different procedures on there. But yeah, and so actually that, just to give you an idea of what some of these counting stations look like, that picture on the right is actually a picture of a Harris County central counting station from last year's election. Next slide, please. All right, so I promised you we were going to get back to the concept of election returns, and here it is. So once all of those precinct returns are completed, once the central counting station has come up with their returns as well, what happens with those returns? How are they submitted to the appropriate authorities? So let's go back to the traditional polling location. So the copy of the returns that's required to be delivered to the county clerk or the elections administrator, again, depends on the county, shall be delivered not later than 2 hours or as soon thereafter as practicable, after the closing of the polls or after the last person voted, whichever is later. So the goal here is to get those election returns to the county clerk or elections administrator within 2 hours after the last vote is cast or the polling location is closed. If we are running in a central counting station method, the ballot shall be delivered to the station not later than 2 hours. Sorry about that. If we're talking about central counting stations, the ballots themselves shall be delivered to the station not later than 2 hours or as soon thereafter as practicable, after the closing of the polls or after the last person's voted, again, whichever is later. And in central counting station, the copy of the returns required to be delivered to the county clerk or elections administrator shall be delivered by the presiding judge of the counting station immediately upon completion of the returns. So, the goal for the traditional polling locations is to get all of this information into the county clerk or elections administrator within 2 hours. If you're using a central counting station method, they have to be delivered as close to 2 hours as possible. And then the returns have to be delivered to the county clerk or elections administrator immediately upon completion. Next slide, please. All right, so you may be asking, what is the Secretary of State doing during this tabulation process? And they actually have a couple of different things that they do about reporting during and after this tabulation process. During the tabulation process, the Secretary of State shall publish periodic reports covering the races being tabulated. So if you look up top, the Secretary of State's recently revamped their election results website. That's what the new website looks like. But if you've ever gone to an election return site and you've seen something like, 100 counties of 254 counties reporting, or 93% of precincts reporting, that's one of these periodic reports that the Secretary of State publishes while votes are being tabulated. And then after tabulation, the Secretary of State shall publish a final report covering the races being tabulated. And that's what we'll see. You actually see a snapshot of their report on the top of the screen here. 100% of counties reporting, 100% of polling locations reporting. So yeah, that is something that the Secretary of State's office does during and after the tabulation process. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about something called reconciliation forms, and these are specific to central counting stations. The presiding judge of a central counting station shall provide and attest to a written reconciliation of votes and voters at 2 different times. One is at the close of tabulation for election day, and then 2 is after the central counting station meets for the last time to process late arriving ballots by mail and provisional ballots. So I found a picture of the official reconciliation form on the right. It's got spots. It's got the first box is for how many voters or how many votes were registered in that precinct or central counting station, I should say. It's also got boxes for any irregularly marked ballots, how many provisional ballots were received at that counting station, mail-in ballots. But yeah, 2 of these have to be filled out. Again, 1 at the close of tabulation for election day, and then 1 is after the last meeting of the central counting station to process late arriving ballots and provisional ballots. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to shift from election day to what happens, how are ballots that are cast early, how are mail-in ballots, how are provisional ballots, how are they counted? And that is through a process or through a group called an early voting ballot board, or an EVBB. The early voting ballot board actually accepts or rejects and counts all early ballots, so all ballots cast during early voting, all timely delivered mail-in ballots, and all provisional ballots. And I just want to note that every county in the state must, by state law, have an early voting ballot board. And again, just to reiterate, this is the group who actually counts early mail-in and provisional ballots. So each early voting ballot board is going to be comprised of a presiding judge, an alternate judge, and at least one other member, and their appointees chosen by the county election board from lists designated by the political parties. And as much as possible, there should be an equal number from each party. So what is a county election board? Each county is going to have a county election board. Some counties' election boards are actually very active. Some are less active. It just depends on the county. But a county election board is made up of the county judge, the county clerk, the voter registrar, whether that's the tax assessor collector or an elections administrator. It's also made up of the sheriff and the county chair of each political party required to nominate candidates via a primary election. And in Texas right now, that's the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Next slide, please. All right, so how do early voting ballot boards actually receive these ballots, these early cast ballots and mail-in ballots? That responsibility falls onto the early voting clerk, which is going to be either the county clerk or the elections administrator. They have the responsibility of actually delivering the early voting and mail-in ballots to the early voting ballot board, along with all of the poll rosters, any of the envelopes for mail-in ballots, and any other voting documents that are necessary. So this is the first time we're going to see this distinction between counties with populations under 100,000 and over 100,000 a couple of times in this presentation. This is the first time we're going to see it. So for counties with populations under 100,000, mail-in ballots may be delivered to the early voting ballot board between the end of the early voting period, which is November 1st this year, and the closing of polls on election day, November 5th. And just for reference, anytime you see a date in here like November 1st or November 5th, those dates are going to be directly applicable to this fall's election. So that's for counties under 100,000 in population. For counties with a population of over 100,000, mail-in ballots may be delivered between the end of the 9th day before the last day of the period of early voting. It's just easier to remember that's October 23rd this year, and the closing of polls on election day, again, November 5th. Next slide, please. So here's some of the procedure about accepting and rejecting mail-in ballots, processing ballots, and when this counting actually takes place. So for accepting and rejecting mail-in ballots, again, remember every early voting ballot board, they have the responsibility to accept or reject all mail-in ballots. There is a multi-step process for accepting each mail-in ballot. And that is found in section 87.041 of the Texas Election Code. And they have to meet, each one of the ballots has to meet every single one of those requirements on there. It's a pretty long and detailed list. So I would just encourage, if you have any questions about it, to take a look at that section of the election code. But if a ballot is rejected, if it failed to meet any of those requirements set out in 87.041 and it's rejected, the early voting ballot board must deliver a written notice to the rejected voter not later than the 10th day after election day. So that's November 15th. And so moving on to processing ballots before polls open, an early voting ballot board may determine whether to accept early voting ballots voted by mail in accordance with section 87.041 at any time after the ballots are delivered to the board. And by accepting these ballots, they will go through and make sure that it meets all of those procedures laid out in the election code, but they won't count them. They won't necessarily count them at that exact time. So if we move down to this final bullet point, counting early voting and mail-in ballots. First thing to note, the early voting ballot board of a county uses the same procedures for counting as all of the election day polling places in that county. So if we're a county that uses a traditional polling place method and uses paper ballots, that county's early voting ballot board is going to use the same procedures for counting the ballots that they're responsible for as the election day polling places. Likewise, if the county uses the optical scan method or the direct recording electronic method. So the early voting ballot board may not count early voting ballots until the polls open on election day, November 5th, or in an election conducted by an authority of a county with a population of 100,000 or more, the end of in-person early voting, which is again November 1st. So you see again, there's that dichotomy, that split between counties over 100,000 and counties under 100,000. Next slide, please. All right, so you've seen mentioned timely delivered mail-in ballots. You've seen the term late mail-in ballots a couple of times at this point in time. So let's dive into what that means. In general, mail-in ballots must arrive before the time polls close on election day, unless the ballot falls into one of the categories that we're going to describe below. And then just as a note, the early voting ballot board must convene not later than the 13th day after the election, November 18th this year, to count mail-in ballots that arrive after that election date deadline. All right, so what are the deadlines for late mail-in ballots? So there are a couple of situations where a voter can mail in a ballot that the county receives after election day, and that's still okay. So the first of those situations is any late domestic ballots. Those would be from non-military and any military voters who submitted an application for ballot by mail, which is the technical term for a mail-in ballot application in Texas. But any late domestic ballots that were placed for delivery no later than 7 p.m. local time on election day, November 5th, and were received no later than 5 p.m. on the first business day after election day, November 6th this year. So those are late mail-in ballots, but they would also be deemed as timely. A second category would be any late ballots that were submitted from outside the United States by voters who applied for a ballot using an application for ballot by mail, or by non-military voters who applied for a ballot using something called a federal postcard application. That's a form that's provided by the federal government that's just another voter registration and mail-in ballot form. For those ballots, any ballots that were received by the 6th day after election or November 11th would also be deemed timely. Then the final category would be any ballots received by the 6th day after election day, again, November 11th, from voters who are members of the U.S. Armed Forces or the spouse or a dependent of a member of the armed forces who applied for a ballot using one of those federal postcard applications. So those are the deadlines for late mail-in ballots to still be deemed timely delivered. Next slide, please. All right, so the final slide on counting ballots is what to do about provisional ballots. So when might a voter have to vote provisionally? By far the most common occurrence is when they failed to present either an acceptable photo ID or a supporting ID alongside a reasonable impediment declaration. If they were not on the list of registered voters, or if they applied for a mail-in ballot but did not bring that mail-in ballot with them to cancel at their polling place. So how do the early voting ballot boards count and deal with provisional ballots? They must meet no later than the 9th day after the election, November 14th, to verify and count provisional ballots. So the early voting ballot board examines the affidavits accompanying the provisional ballots and determines whether to accept them. And then for any ballots that were provisional due to the lack of identification, the voter has through the 6th day after the election, again, November 11th, to present the required identification to the voter registrar or execute a reasonable impediment declaration. Next slide, please. All right, so after all of that, we've finally gotten out of the realm of counting ballots and we're moving into canvassing election returns. And this is chapter 67 of the Texas Election Code. So the first question we're going to ask is, what is canvassing? And then we're going to talk about state canvasses and county and local canvasses as well. Next slide, please. What is canvassing? fundamental question. What is canvassing before we go any farther in this? Canvassing is just the official examination of the election returns. So canvassing tallies the total number of voters in each precinct who cast a ballot for a candidate or for or against a measure. And for anybody who wants to attend next week's presentation, and I highly recommend that you do, we're going to be talking about election audits, recounts, and election contests. This is kind of a note just for anybody who comes and joins us next week. Canvassing is not a recount. They are two separate, legally distinct processes. So the second term I want you to keep in mind while we're going through this section is what a canvassing authority is. And a canvassing authority is the governmental body that is responsible for canvassing a particular election. Now, this changes depending on which specific election is being canvassed. For statewide offices, except for governor and lieutenant governor, they're a special exception. But for statewide offices, except for those two offices, precinct election returns are going to be canvassed by the county commissioner's court of each county in the state, so all 254 of them. And then county election returns, which are the sum total of all precinct returns, are going to be canvassed by the governor's office. If we're talking about just a county election, so your county commissioner's court, your county judge, that county's commissioner's court is going to canvass those election returns. And then all other local elections, think mayor, city council, elections at that level, the governing body of the relevant political subdivision is going to be the canvassing authority. Next slide, please. All right, so let's jump into state canvasses. So which elections are we actually talking about here? So as we mentioned on the last slide, county election returns for an election for statewide office, other than governor or lieutenant governor, any statewide measures, think state constitutional amendments, any district office, or importantly this year, president and vice president of the United States. All of those county election returns are canvassed by the governor. For November general elections, all of these state canvasses are going to take place no earlier than the 18th day after election and no later than the 33rd day after the election. So that gives a date range of November 23rd to December 8th this year. And following this canvass, the governor, and this is a direct quote from the election code, quote, shall prepare a certificate of election for each successful candidate, which he, quote, shall promptly deliver to that candidate unless a recount is pending. For county election returns, for the office of governor and lieutenant governor, I said that they were a special exception, they're actually canvassed by the state legislature. And the Speaker of the House delivers the results of that canvass to the Secretary of State's office. And then that canvass is actually going to take place during the first week of the following legislative session. Next slide, please. All right, jumping over to county canvasses. So each county's commissioner's court shall canvass precinct returns for statewide and county elections. And for November general elections, an even number of years, so this fall's election, the canvass must take place between 3 and 14 days after election day. So that gives us a date range of November 8th to November 19th. And importantly, the county cannot start the canvass until all late mail-in ballots and provisional ballots are counted. So the canvassing authority, quote, shall open the returns for each precinct and, quote, shall prepare a tabulation of the votes for each candidate. And just some general notes about the canvassing authority at a county level. 2 members of the canvassing authority constitute a quorum for canvassing an election. And something that might be of interest to lots of people on this phone call, all meetings of the canvassing authority must be conducted in compliance with the Texas Open Meetings Act. And then moving on to local canvasses, and you're going to see the procedure is virtually identical. For other local elections, returns are canvassed by the governing body of the relevant political subdivision. For this fall's election, they're going to have between November 8th and November 19th to complete that canvass. Can't start until all the late mail-in ballots and provisional ballots are counted. The local canvassing authority shall open the returns for each precinct and prepare a tabulation of the votes for each candidate. And again, 2 members of the authority constitute a quorum, and their meetings must also be conducted in compliance with the Texas Open Meetings Act. So you may have noticed that I was trying, hopefully it came through, I was trying to put some emphasis on the phrases in those last couple of sections where It said that a canvassing authority shall conduct a canvass. They shall produce tabulation results. They shall, and that's because, a major question about any of these situations where we get into possible subversion of the post-election process is which of these steps is mandatory or ministerial, which of these is discretionary. Well, in Texas courts have held that canvassing election returns is a ministerial function. And that means, just in short, that it's a non-discretionary function. You can't just decide not to canvass an election. If a canvassing authority refuses to conduct a canvass, the Texas Supreme Court or a state court of appeals may issue a writ of mandamus that orders the canvassing authority to conduct the canvass. And importantly, they can also issue a writ of mandamus to compel, quote, any duty imposed by law in connection with the holding of an election or a political party convention, regardless of whether the person responsible for performing the duty is a public officer. So that kind of goes back to the cases, particularly in Otero County, New Mexico, and Cochise County, Arizona, where the New Mexico State Supreme Court and a state judge in Arizona had to get involved in ordering these post-election processes be completed. Next slide, please. All right, so final section, and this one's very quick because for as important as certifying elections is, there's very little in the Texas Election Code that actually discusses the process. It is one section of the Texas Election Code is all, and that's 67.016. So we're quickly going to go over what the certification process entails, what needs to be on a certificate of election, and then we're going to try and answer the million-dollar question, is certification of elections mandatory in Texas? So the certification process for county and local races, once the canvassing is complete and a winner is determined, the presiding officer of the canvassing authority must prepare a certificate of election and promptly deliver it to the prevailing candidate unless a recount is pending. I forgot to mention it briefly on the last couple of slides about county and local canvasses, but once those canvasses are completed, that is what determines the formal winner of county and local elections. So once the canvassing is completed and a winner is determined, the canvassing authority must prepare the certificate of election and deliver it to the prevailing candidate. For statewide races, again, with the exception of governor and lieutenant governor, following the canvass, the governor, quote, shall prepare a certificate of election for each successful candidate, which they, quote, shall promptly deliver to that candidate unless a recount is pending. Again, we're going to talk about recounts in our presentation next week, but if a recount is pending, then no certificate of election can be issued. So what has to actually be on a certificate of election? You can find the list in section 67.016C of the Texas Election Code. A certificate of election must contain the candidate's name, the office to which the candidate is elected, a statement of election to an unexpired term, if applicable, the date of the election in question, the signature of the officer preparing the certificate, and any seal used by that officer to authenticate documents that they execute or certify. And that's it. There's no, a lot of times in the election code, we find like specific language that has to be included in various forms, or some type of directive along the lines of the Secretary of State will come up with this form. But when it comes to election certificates, this is it. There is no form. There is no model language found in the Texas Election Code. And so, million-dollar question: is certification of elections mandatory in Texas? The answer is probably yes. We saw just in the very brief language in the election code that deals with election certification that the term "shall" applies is applied multiple times. There's also a court case called Orth v. Benavides from a Texas Court of Appeals back in 1939. Still good law, been cited multiple times in the almost 100 years since it was handed down. And just a useful quote on answering this question from Orth: after the result of an election has been declared, the issuing of the certificate of election is a ministerial duty and a mere matter of form. It's also, like I said, it's been cited in other cases since then. It's also been cited in multiple attorney general's opinions, including one from our now current governor, Greg Abbott, in 2004, where his office at the time stated that electors must not be deprived of their votes on account of any technical objection to the manner in which the election has been held, or for any misconduct on the part of the presiding officers, if these have not affected the true result of the election. So I wish I could just say for sure, 100% yes, certification is mandatory. But until the Texas Supreme Court specifically says it, or the state legislature writes it into the election code, our best guess is that yes, it probably is mandatory. And so with that, that is the final slide. We dove through counting, we dove through canvassing, we went through certification. So now I'd just like to, with the last 10 minutes or so of our presentation, the time we have left tonight, just open the floor to any questions any of y'all might have.
Hi, thanks for the info. I'm just curious, is there a list of which counties use which method?
You mean paper ballots, optical scan, and DRE?
Correct.
Correct. Yeah. Yes. That information is available on the Texas Secretary of State's election, the election section of their website. Yes.
Thank you.
I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but most of the larger counties are going to use either optical scan or DRE, whereas the paper ballots would be typically used in some of the smaller counties across our state. Eileen, yes. Yeah, we can, after all of our presentations are done, we're going to be reaching back out to everybody with extra resources and information. And yeah, we can definitely see about sending a copy. It may just be a PDF copy, but yeah, we can definitely look into that. Jay, I see that you have your hand up.
Thank you. So I was a little confused because, so here in Travis County, for early voting, we go to the same poll places mostly that are open on election day. We use the same mechanism. And so when in your talk, I thought there was a reference to early voting ballots being delivered to that board. So do the people who preside over each polling place use the same procedure? They just do it several times during the early voting period? Because it seemed weird to have different procedures where it's the same environment and same process for the individual voter.
Just for clarification, are you talking about the early voting ballot board? How ballots are delivered to the early voting ballot board after they've been cast?
Right.
Yeah, it's going to vary by county, but the counties, you could have a situation where, provided they fit in that time zone, that time frame of when they can be delivered. Yeah, some counties are going to start processing those ballots. Remember, they can't count them before October 23rd, or they can't start doing that until, but. Yeah, some counties are going to deliver ballots multiple times, every day, every couple of days. Some counties might wait until the end of that period when they have to deliver all of the ballots in one big batch. I don't specifically know if Travis County, I don't know if they take that approach of delivering them all in one big batch to the early voting ballot board, or whether trickle in probably isn't really the right word, but whether they kind of, periodically deliver them.
But
yeah,
so maybe if I could, sorry for interrupting, in the interest of time, let me just clarify my question. You're addressing even electronic early voting, not mail-in early voting only, right?
Oh, for the early voting ballot board?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. They have they have result tapes, and the method of delivery, or I shouldn't say the method. So for For the paper ballots, it's pretty simple. You know, the ballots are going to be delivered. The actual physical ballots are going to be delivered. For the optical scan, you're going to deliver all of the electronic media. Same with the digital recording electronic, or I'm sorry, the direct recording electronic. So yeah, you're going to have something delivered, whichever system is used, you're going to have something physical that is delivered to the early voting ballot board.
Okay, thank you.
Did that yeah, no problem. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Not a problem at all. Yeah, and so just as a brief stop, and we'll get back to questions in just a second. Veronica put on the last slide, and this is the course number for CLE Credit. You can either use the QR code that's on the screen or and manually enter the course number. And just as a note, if there's anybody else that you think might be interested in this, anybody you want to pass this on to, starting on August 19th, we're going to be posting all 4 of our CLE presentations from this summer CLE series online, probably YouTube. That's probably where we're going to post them. And that way you can access these on demand. You can watch this again if there was something you felt you missed or you wanted some clarity. And we're also going to update those videos once they're on demand with new CLE course numbers. And that way, for anybody who wasn't able to make it to either tonight's presentation or one of our other presentations, they can get CLE credit for it as well. So, but yeah, so let's see, are there any other questions either in the, Veronica, are there any questions in the chat, or did anybody else want to raise their hand and ask a question that way?
I don't see any more questions in the chat, but if anybody else wants to ask a question, please fire away.
All right, well, while we're waiting to see if anybody else has any other questions, let me just put a plug in for, oh, no problem. Thank you. Thank you for being here, Rudy. But yeah, just let me put a plug in for the last 2 sessions of our summer CLE series. Next Tuesday, same time, 6 p.m. Central, we're going to be talking about election recounts, contests, and audits. So that's kind of part 2 of this post-election process. And then on August 13th, Veronica and I are really excited about our presentation. We are teaming up with the amazing folks over at Asian Texans for Justice. And we are going to be talking about language accessibility at the polls. So that's going to be on Tuesday, August 13th, again, 6 p.m. Central. And then once on August 19th, once we've gotten all of our videos posted, I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you take a look and watch the presentation that Veronica did last week with our wonderful friends over at Disability Rights Texas on disability access at the polls. So we have 4 presentations, and we're really proud of all 4 of them. And hopefully, if you missed one of them, if you can't make one of the last 2, you get a chance to come and watch them on demand. And please feel free to share all of that with anybody who may be interested, any networks that you have, any organizations that you're a member of. We love for, you know, like I said up at the front of this presentation, we want this information to get out. So the more people who know about this stuff, the more people who understand these processes, the better, and the more, the better it is for all Texas voters. So, all right, folks, so last call for questions. And if nothing, no other questions, then I will say a very heartfelt thank you for all of you who attended today. I'm very sorry about the technical problems. We are definitely going to try and get all of those sorted out for next week's presentation. And hopefully we see you next week. So thank you so much, everybody.